Maria Santos had always been small for her age, standing barely 5 feet 4 inches even in her combat boots. At 32, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove to anyone, yet everything to prove to herself every single day. Her weathered hands gripped the steering wheel of her old pickup truck as she pulled into the parking lot of Coronado Beach, California, where the morning sun cast long shadows across the sand. She had driven down from Los Angeles before dawn, seeking the peace that only the ocean could provide. The nightmares had been getting worse again, and her therapist had suggested she return to places that held positive memories. Coronado Beach was where she had first learned to swim properly, where she had pushed her body beyond what anyone thought possible for a girl from East LA whose parents cleaned offices for a living. Maria grabbed her worn leather bag from the passenger seat, checking to make sure her old military helmet was still inside. She rarely brought it out anymore, but something about today felt different. The helmet had seen better days, that was certain. The green paint had chipped away in places, revealing the dull metal underneath, and what most people would call rust had formed small patches across its surface. But those weren't rust stains at all, though Maria had never bothered to correct anyone who assumed they were. Walking across the sand, she found her usual spot near the pier where the morning joggers and early surfers hadn't yet discovered her. She spread out her small blanket and sat cross-legged, placing the helmet beside her as she watched the waves crash against the shore. This was her meditation, her way of processing everything that had happened in her 20-year military career. The sound of laughter and shouting broke through her peaceful moment. A group of men in Navy PT gear were setting up some kind of training exercise about 50 yards down the beach. Maria recognized the type immediately, even from this distance. Their movements were too precise, too coordinated to be regular Navy. These were special operations, probably SEALs based on the location and the way they carried themselves. She watched as they began what looked like a beach conditioning workout, pushing each other through burpees, mountain climbers, and sand sprints. Their instructor, a tall man with arms like tree trunks, barked orders that carried on the wind. Maria found herself smiling slightly, remembering her own days of similar torture, though her training had taken place in very different circumstances. One of the younger SEALs noticed her sitting alone and pointed her out to his buddies. Maria could see them looking in her direction, probably wondering what a small woman was doing sitting by herself on the beach so early in the morning. She ignored them and continued her meditation, focusing on the rhythm of the waves. But the SEALs were apparently more interested in her presence than she had hoped. After about 20 minutes of their workout, 3 of them jogged over in her direction. Maria didn't look up until their shadows fell across her blanket. "Morning, ma'am," said the apparent leader, a blond man who looked like he spent more time in the gym than humanly possible. "Beautiful morning for the beach." "It is," Maria replied simply, not looking up from the water. "You military?" asked another one, this one with a thick Boston accent. "You've got the look." Maria finally glanced up at them. All 3 were young, probably in their mid-20s, with the kind of confidence that came from knowing they were among the most elite soldiers in the world. "Was," she said. "What branch?" the blonde one pressed. "Army," Maria answered, which was technically true, though it wasn't the whole truth. The 3 men exchanged glances that Maria caught out of the corner of her eye. There was something in their expressions that she had seen before many times. It was the look that said they were trying to figure out how to be polite while also making it clear that they didn't think much of regular Army compared to Navy SEALs. "That's cool," said the 3rd man, who had been silent until now. "What was your MOS?" "Transportation," Maria lied smoothly. It was the most boring, non-threatening military job she could think of, and she had learned long ago that sometimes it was easier to let people underestimate her than to deal with their reactions to the truth. She could practically see their interest deflate. Transportation meant driving trucks and moving supplies, About as far from special operations as you could get while still being in the military. The blonde one nodded politely. Well, thanks for your service, he said in the tone people used when they were trying to be respectful, but had already lost interest in the conversation. As they turned to head back to their workout, one of them noticed her helmet sitting on the blanket. "Nice helmet," said the Boston accent guy, and there was definitely sarcasm in his voice now. "Looks like it's seen some action." The other two looked down at it, and Maria could see them trying not to laugh. To them, it probably looked like some worn-out piece of surplus gear that a former transportation soldier kept as a memento of her time-changing truck tires and checking oil levels. "Is that rust?" asked the quiet one, pointing at the reddish-brown stains that covered parts of the helmet. "Looks like it," said the blonde. "Might want to get that checked out." "Don't want tetanus or anything?" They were openly grinning now, not even trying to hide their amusement. Maria had seen this reaction before, too. To most people, her helmet looked like a piece of junk that someone should have thrown away years ago. She let them have their moment. "We should get back," said Boston accent, slapping his buddies on the shoulders. "Chief's going to make us run extra miles if we're late." As they jogged away, Maria could hear them laughing and making comments about Army transportation and rusty old gear. She wasn't angry. She had stopped getting angry about things like this a long time ago. People saw what they wanted to see, and most of the time it was easier to let them. She picked up the helmet and held it in her lap, running her fingers over the stained surface. Those weren't rust stains, though she understood why people thought they were. The reddish-brown marks were something else entirely. Something that told a very different story about where this helmet had been and what it had witnessed. Maria had joined the Army at 18, straight out of high school in East LA. Her parents had wanted her to go to college, but college cost money they didn't have, and the military offered a way out of the neighborhood and a chance to see the world. She had been good at everything they threw at her in basic training. Really good. Good enough that her drill sergeant started asking questions about what she wanted to do with her military career. At first, she had planned to do her 4 years and get out, maybe use the GI Bill to go to college and become a teacher or a nurse. But somewhere along the way, she discovered that she was exceptional at things that most people couldn't even imagine doing. She could shoot better than soldiers who had been in the Army for a decade. She could run farther and faster than men twice her size. Most importantly, she could think clearly under pressure in ways that made her instructors take notice. By her second year, Maria had been recruited for specialized training, the kind of training that didn't exist on any official Army records, the kind of training that prepared soldiers for missions that the government would never acknowledge existed. She spent the next 18 years of her life doing things that she could never talk about to anyone, in places that didn't appear on any maps. The helmet had been with her for most of those 18 years. It had protected her head in 3 different countries during operations that had never made the news. Those stains that looked like rust were actually dried blood from a mission in Africa where her team had held a position for 16 hours against overwhelming odds, waiting for extraction that almost never came. She had taken shrapnel from an IED in that particular mission, and while the medic worked to patch up her leg, blood had dripped onto her helmet. Rather than clean it off, she had left it there as a reminder. There were other stains, too, from other missions, other close calls. Each mark told a story that she would never be able to share with anyone. Maria looked back down the beach where the SEALs were continuing their workout. They were good soldiers, she could see that much. They moved with the kind of precision and teamwork that only came from extensive training and combat experience. In a fair fight, any one of them could probably take down 3 or 4 regular soldiers without breaking a sweat. But they had no idea who they had just been talking to. No idea that the small woman with the rusty helmet sitting alone on the beach had a service record that would make their own accomplishments look like basic training exercises. Not because she was better than them, necessarily, but because she had been doing things that were so classified that even most generals didn't know they existed. The Army had given her medals for some of her missions, but they were the kind of medals that came in unmarked boxes with no ceremony and no explanation of why she had earned them. She kept them in a drawer at home and never looked at them. The real reward for her service wasn't recognition or praise. It was knowing that she had made a difference in ways that she could never discuss with anyone. Maria put the helmet back down beside her and returned to watching the waves. She wasn't angry at the SEALs for their assumptions. In a way, she was proud that she could still blend in, still look like just another veteran who had done her time and gotten out. It meant her real identity was still safe, still protected by the layers of classification and misdirection that had kept her alive for 2 decades. But sometimes, just sometimes, she wished she could tell someone the truth about what those stains on her helmet really were, about the missions that had earned them, about the times when she and her team had been the only thing standing between American citizens and threats they would never even know existed. The sun was getting higher now, and more people were starting to arrive at the beach, families with children, couples walking hand in hand, surfers heading out to catch the morning waves. Maria watched them all and felt the familiar mix of satisfaction and loneliness that came with her secret knowledge. These people could go about their lives, could let their children play in the sand and worry about normal things like homework and mortgage payments and what to make for dinner, partly because she and others like her had spent years in the shadows making sure the real monsters never made it to places like this. Down the beach, the SEALs were finishing up their workout. Maria could see them gathering their gear and preparing to head back to base. In a few hours, they would probably be telling their friends about the weird Army transportation lady with the rusty helmet they had met on the beach. It would be a funny story to them, a small moment of superiority in their day. Maria didn't mind being their funny story. She had learned long ago that sometimes the best way to serve your country was to let people think you were nobody special. It was easier to do her job when people underestimated her, when they dismissed her as just another small woman trying to get by in a man's world. She packed up her things and prepared to head home. Tomorrow she had an appointment with her therapist, and she was actually looking forward to it for once. Being back at the beach had helped, just like the doctor had said it would. The peace she felt watching the waves had reminded her why she had chosen the life she had chosen, and why the sacrifices had been worth it. As she walked back to her truck, Maria took one last look at the spot where the SEALs had been training. They were gone now, probably already back at their base, getting ready for whatever mission they had coming up next. She wished them luck and hoped they would never have to do the kinds of things she had done. The world was a better place when wars could be fought by conventional soldiers in conventional ways. But if the time ever came when conventional wasn't enough, if the threats became too big or too strange or too dangerous for normal military operations, Maria knew there were still people like her ready to step back into the shadows and do what needed to be done. People who looked like nobody special and carried equipment that seemed worn out and worthless, but who had skills and experience that couldn't be taught in any normal military training. The drive back to Los Angeles took her through several military communities, and Maria found herself thinking about all the veterans she knew who were carrying similar secrets. Men and women who had served in units that didn't officially exist, who had completed missions that would never be declassified, who went to sleep every night knowing they had made the world safer, but could never tell anyone how. It was a strange kind of patriotism, loving your country so much that you were willing to be forgotten by it. But as Maria merged onto the freeway and headed home, she realized she wouldn't have it any other way. Some stories were meant to be kept secret, and some heroes were meant to remain unknown. Her helmet sat in the passenger seat beside her, its stained surface telling a story that would never be written in any history book. And that was exactly how it should be. 3 weeks had passed since Maria's encounter with the SEALs on Coronado Beach. She had returned to her quiet routine in Los Angeles, working her cover job as a logistics coordinator for a shipping company and attending her weekly therapy sessions. The nightmares had subsided somewhat, and she was sleeping better than she had in months. But on a Thursday evening in late September, her carefully constructed, peaceful existence was interrupted by a phone call that changed everything. "Maria, this is Colonel Peterson," came the familiar voice through her encrypted phone. "I know you're retired, but we have a situation." Maria closed her eyes and sank into her kitchen chair. Colonel Peterson had been her handler for the last 8 years of her active duty. He only called when something had gone seriously wrong. "What kind of situation?" she asked, though she already knew she wasn't going to like the answer. "We've got a hostage situation in San Diego. 3 Americans taken by a group we've been tracking for months. They're holed up in a warehouse complex near the port, and they're demanding things we can't give them. Call the FBI. Call the local SWAT team. This isn't my problem anymore," Maria said. But even as she spoke the words, she knew she didn't mean them. "We tried. The local teams don't have the experience for this particular group. These aren't ordinary criminals, Maria. They're former military from 3 different countries, all with special operations backgrounds. They know how law enforcement thinks, how they operate. We need someone who can think like they do, but better." Maria was quiet for a long moment, staring out her kitchen window at the normal suburban street where children rode bicycles and neighbors walked their dogs. "How long do I have to think about it?" "The plane leaves from LAX in 2 hours. You'll be working with a Navy SEAL team that's already in position. They've been briefed that they're getting a civilian consultant with relevant experience." "They won't like that," Maria said. "They don't have to like it. They just have to listen to you when it matters." An hour and a half later, Maria was sitting in the back of a military transport plane heading toward San Diego, her old helmet bag in her lap, and a knot of familiar anxiety in her stomach. She had sworn after her last mission that she was done with this life, done with the adrenaline and the violence and the weight of other people's lives in her hands. But here she was again, because when your country called and lives were on the line, some people found it impossible to say no. The plane landed at Naval Air Station North Island, where a young sailor met her at the aircraft and drove her to a temporary command post that had been set up in a vacant office building about a mile from the warehouse complex where the hostages were being held. The command post was a controlled chaos of communication equipment, tactical displays, and serious-faced military personnel hunched over laptops and radios. Maria recognized the type of operation immediately. This was the kind of careful, methodical planning that happened before someone did something very dangerous and very necessary. "You must be Santos," said a voice behind her. Maria turned to see a Navy captain approaching, his uniform crisp despite the late hour. "I'm Captain Morrison, overall commander for this operation. Colonel Peterson speaks very highly of your expertise." "Thank you, sir," Maria replied. "What's the current situation?" Captain Morrison led her to a large table covered with building blueprints and satellite photos. 3 hostages, all civilian contractors who were working on a classified project at the shipyard. The group holding them has identified themselves as the International Brotherhood, which our intelligence people tell me is basically a mercenary organization that hires out to whoever pays the most. "How many hostage takers?" "We believe 7, possibly 8. All former special operations from various countries. The leader appears to be a former Russian Spetsnaz operator named Viktor Kozlov. He was kicked out of the Russian military for conduct violations, but has been working as a freelance operative ever since." Maria studied the photos and blueprints, her mind automatically analyzing sight lines, entry points, and potential complications. It felt good to be using this part of her brain again, even though she had tried to shut it off completely. "What do they want?" That's where it gets complicated, Captain Morrison said. They're demanding the release of someone named Hassan al-Rashid, who's currently being held in federal prison in Colorado. Al-Rashid was convicted of terrorism charges 3 years ago. And we're not going to release him. Absolutely not. Which is why we need another solution. Captain Morrison gestured toward the far end of the command post, where Maria could see a group of men in tactical gear huddled around their own set of maps and equipment. The SEAL team that will be executing the operation is over there. Team leader is Lieutenant Commander Jake Mitchell. Good man, extensive combat experience. As they approached the SEAL team, Maria realized with a sinking feeling that she recognized some of the faces. Standing around the tactical display were the same 3 men she had encountered on Coronado Beach 3 weeks earlier, plus several others she didn't recognize. The blonde team leader, who she now knew was Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, looked up as they approached. His expression was polite but clearly puzzled as he took in Maria's civilian clothes and small stature. "Sir," he said to Captain Morrison, "is this our civilian consultant?" "This is Maria Santos," the captain replied. "She has extensive experience with this type of situation." Maria could see the doubt in Mitchell's eyes, and she could practically read the thoughts running through his head. This was the same small woman they had encountered on the beach, the one with the rusty helmet who had claimed to be Army transportation. Now she was supposed to be an expert consultant on a hostage rescue operation involving former Special Operations personnel. "Ma'am," Mitchell said carefully, "no disrespect, but can you give us some idea of your background and qualifications for this type of operation?" It was a fair question, and Maria had dealt with skeptical team leaders before. The problem was that her real qualifications were so classified that she couldn't discuss them with anyone who didn't have the appropriate clearances. And she was fairly certain that even elite Navy SEALs didn't have access to information about her actual unit and mission history. "I spent 20 years in situations similar to this one," she said finally. "I know how these types of hostage takers think, and I know how to plan operations against former Special Operations personnel." The Boston accent SEAL, whose name tag identified him as Petty Officer Rodriguez, was looking at her with obvious confusion. "Ma'am, didn't you tell us you were Army transportation?" Maria glanced at Captain Morrison, who nodded slightly. He had obviously been briefed on at least some of her real background. "My actual military occupation specialty is classified," Maria said. "Transportation was a cover story." She could see the SEALs exchanging glances. They were clearly having trouble reconciling the small woman they had dismissed on the beach with someone who supposedly had classified Special Operations experience. "All right," Lieutenant Commander Mitchell said diplomatically. "Why don't you take a look at our current plan and let us know if you have any suggestions?" For the next hour, Maria studied the SEALs' tactical plan for the hostage rescue. It was competent and professional, exactly what she would expect from a well-trained Special Operations team. It was also completely wrong for this particular situation. "Your plan assumes that the hostage takers will behave like regular criminals," she said finally, "but they won't. Former Special Operations personnel think differently, especially when they're cornered." "How so?" asked Mitchell. Maria pointed to the blueprint of the warehouse complex. "You're planning a simultaneous breach from 3 points, with the assumption that you'll overwhelm them with speed and surprise. But these guys know that's exactly how Special Operations teams operate. They'll be expecting it." "So, what do you suggest?" asked Petty Officer Rodriguez, and Maria could hear the skepticism in his voice. "You do something they won't expect. Something that goes against normal Special Operations doctrine." For the next 2 hours, Maria walked the SEAL team through an alternative plan that was unlike anything they had been trained to do. Instead of a fast, coordinated assault, she suggested a slow, methodical approach that would make the hostage-takers think they were dealing with regular law enforcement. "This is the opposite of everything we've learned," said the quiet SEAL, whose name tag read Thompson. "That's exactly the point," Maria explained. Viktor Kozlov has probably been studying American Special Operations tactics for years. He knows how Navy SEALs operate, how Delta Force operates, how all of our elite units operate. He's counting on you to do what you've been trained to do. But your plan could take hours, Mitchell said. The hostages could be killed if we move too slowly. The hostages will definitely be killed if Kozlov realizes he's facing American Special Operations, Maria replied. These guys aren't planning to surrender. They're planning to go down fighting, and they'll take the hostages with them if they think they're cornered by professionals. Captain Morrison had been listening to the entire conversation from across the room. Now he approached the group and looked directly at Maria. Ms. Santos, I need to ask you directly. Are you confident that your plan will work? Maria looked around at the faces of the SEAL team. All of them clearly skeptical of taking advice from someone they still saw as a former truck driver with delusions of tactical expertise. She understood their skepticism, but she also knew things about this type of operation that they simply didn't have access to. Sir, I've planned and executed similar operations against former Special Operations personnel before, multiple times. This plan will work, but only if the team follows it exactly as designed. The problem is, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell said carefully, we're being asked to trust our lives and the lives of 3 hostages to someone whose background we can't verify and whose plan goes against everything we've been trained to do. It was a reasonable objection, and Maria couldn't fault them for it. In their position, she would probably feel the same way. But she also knew that if they went with their original plan, they were likely to end up with dead hostages, and possibly dead SEALs as well. I understand your concerns, she said, but I need you to understand something. Viktor Kozlov and his team aren't random criminals. They're professionals who have spent years learning how to counter exactly the kind of operation you're planning to run. And you know this how? Asked Rodriguez. Maria looked at Captain Morrison, who nodded again. She was being given permission to reveal a small piece of her actual background, but she had to be careful not to say too much. Because I've fought against Viktor Kozlov before, she said quietly. 3 years ago in Eastern Europe. He was working for a different organization then, but it's the same man. I know how he thinks, and I know how he operates. The room was quiet for a moment as the SEALs processed this information. The idea that their civilian consultant had actually faced their current adversary before was clearly not something they had expected. You fought against him? Mitchell asked. In what capacity? In a capacity that I can't discuss without higher clearances than any of us have, Maria replied. But I can tell you that he's extremely intelligent, extremely dangerous, and extremely good at predicting how American military units will respond to situations like this. Thompson spoke up for the first time in a while. Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what was the outcome of your previous encounter with this Kozlov guy? Maria allowed herself a small smile. He spent 6 months in a military hospital, and his organization lost $4 million worth of equipment and intelligence data. The SEALs exchanged glances again, but this time the expressions on their faces were different. They were starting to realize that maybe there was more to this small woman than they had initially thought. All right, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell said finally. Let's say we go with your plan. What do you need from us? For the rest of the night, Maria worked with the SEAL team to refine and rehearse the unconventional approach she had designed. It was slow, careful work that required each team member to think differently about their role in the operation. As dawn approached, Maria found herself standing outside the command post, looking toward the warehouse complex where the hostages were being held. In a few hours, she would find out whether 20 years of classified experience had taught her enough to save 3 innocent lives and bring a team of Navy SEALs home safely. Behind her, she could hear the SEALs making final preparations and running through communication checks. They were good soldiers, and they were starting to trust her despite their initial skepticism. But trust in a plan was very different from trust in the person who had created it. Maria knew that if her plan failed, if people died because she had convinced a SEAL team to go against their training, she would carry that weight for the rest of her life. But she also knew that if they went with the conventional approach, failure was almost certain. She closed her eyes and thought about the 3 civilians who were depending on decisions made by people they would never meet. This was the burden of her kind of work. The knowledge that lives hung in the balance of every choice, every plan, every moment of hesitation. When the sun finally rose over San Diego, Maria Santos would find out whether 20 years in the shadows had prepared her for one more mission that officially didn't exist. The operation began at 6 in the morning, just as the sun was casting long shadows across the industrial district, where the warehouse complex sat like a concrete fortress surrounded by chain-link fence and razor wire. Maria had positioned herself in the mobile command unit that Captain Morrison had set up 3 blocks away, watching multiple video feeds from surveillance drones and listening to radio communications between the SEAL team members. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's voice came through clearly on the tactical frequency. "Overwatch, this is Team Leader. We're in position at the outer perimeter, beginning Phase 1 of Consultant's plan." Maria had convinced the SEALs to start with what would appear to be a standard law enforcement response rather than a military operation. Instead of moving directly into assault positions, they were posing as FBI negotiators and local SWAT backup, setting up obvious command posts and communication equipment that Viktor Kozlov would expect to see. "Remember," Maria spoke into her headset, "Kozlov needs to believe he's dealing with federal agents who are in over their heads. Everything you do for the next 2 hours has to look slightly incompetent." "Copy that, Consultant," came Mitchell's reply, and Maria could hear the tension in his voice. Asking Navy SEALs to appear incompetent went against every instinct they had developed over years of training. For the first hour, everything went exactly as Maria had predicted. Kozlov made contact with the supposed FBI negotiators, demanding to speak with someone in authority about prisoner exchange terms. His voice over the intercepted communications was calm and confident, exactly what Maria would expect from someone who believed he was controlling the situation. "He's relaxed," she told Captain Morrison. "He thinks he's dealing with people who don't understand what they're up against." But during the second hour, something went wrong. "Consultant, this is Rodriguez," came an urgent whisper over the radio. "We've got movement on the east side of the building. Looks like they're repositioning their people." Maria felt her stomach tighten. What kind of movement? 2 individuals moving to elevated positions. They're setting up what looks like sniper overwatch. This wasn't part of Kozlov's normal pattern. Maria had studied his previous operations, and he preferred to keep his people together in defensive positions rather than spreading them out. If he was positioning snipers, it meant he suspected something. "Team Leader, pull back to secondary positions immediately," Maria ordered. "Something spooked them." "Copy that. All units, execute fallback to secondary positions." For the next 20 minutes, the situation remained tense, but stable. The SEALs had successfully repositioned without being detected, and Kozlov had resumed his negotiations with the supposed FBI team. But Maria could feel that something fundamental had changed. "Consultant, this is Thompson. I've got eyes on the east side sniper position, and I'm seeing something that doesn't make sense." "What are you seeing?" "The sniper is using hand signals to communicate with someone inside the building, but these aren't standard military signals. They look more like—" Thompson's voice trailed off, and Maria could hear the confusion in his tone. "More like what, Thompson?" "Ma'am, they look like the signals used by classified special operations units. The kind of signals that most people aren't supposed to know exist." Maria felt a chill run down her spine. If Kozlov's team was using classified communication methods, it meant they had access to information that should have been restricted to American special operations personnel. Either they had been trained by someone who shouldn't have trained them, or they had captured and interrogated someone who knew things they shouldn't know. "Captain Morrison," she said, turning to the operation commander. "We need to change the plan, right now." "What's the problem?" "Kozlov's team has access to classified tactical information. They know more about American special operations than my intelligence briefings indicated." Before Captain Morrison could respond, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's voice came over the radio with barely controlled urgency. "Consultant, we've got a major problem. The hostage takers just made a new demand, and it's very specific. They want to speak with someone from Army Special Activities Division." Maria's blood turned to ice. Special Activities Division was so classified that most military personnel had never heard of it. It was the unit that handled operations too sensitive for regular special operations forces, the unit where Maria had spent the last 10 years of her active duty service. "How could they possibly know about Special Activities Division?" Captain Morrison asked. Maria was already reaching for her gear bag, pulling out her old helmet and tactical vest. "Because someone told them. Someone who knew I was going to be here." "That's impossible," Morrison said. "This operation was classified at the highest levels." "Sir, with respect, Viktor Kozlov just demonstrated knowledge of a military unit that officially doesn't exist. Either we have a leak in our security, or this was a setup from the beginning." Maria was strapping on her tactical gear as she spoke, her movements quick and efficient, despite the fact that she hadn't worn this equipment in months. The familiar weight of the body armor and the feel of her helmet settling into place brought back 20 years of muscle memory. "Ma'am, what are you doing?" Captain Morrison asked. "I'm going in there," Maria replied, checking the condition of her sidearm and spare magazines. "If they want someone from Special Activities Division, they're going to get someone from Special Activities Division." "That's absolutely not happening. You're a civilian consultant, not an active operative." Maria looked at Captain Morrison with eyes that had seen more combat than most soldiers could imagine. "Sir, those 3 hostages are going to die if we continue with conventional approaches. Kozlov knows too much about our methods, which means he's been planning this operation specifically to counter American special operations responses. Then we call for backup. We get more units, better equipment." "There isn't time," Maria said firmly. "And more units will just give him more targets to shoot at. This has to be handled by someone who knows how to fight dirty." She was walking toward the command post exit as she spoke, but Captain Morrison moved to block her path. "Ms. Santos, I cannot authorize you to enter an active combat zone. You're not military personnel." Maria stopped and looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached up and turned her helmet so that he could see the left side, where a small emblem was attached just above her ear. Captain Morrison's eyes went wide as he took in the details of the emblem. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before, a combination of symbols that seemed to shift and change depending on how the light hit them. But what shocked him most was that he recognized one element of the design, a small numerical designation that he had only heard whispered about in the most secure briefing rooms in the Pentagon. "That's not possible," he said quietly. "Unit 27 doesn't officially exist," Maria replied, "just like Special Activities Division doesn't officially exist. But sometimes the impossible is exactly what the situation requires. Unit 27 was a legend among military intelligence personnel. It was supposedly a group of soldiers who handled situations too dangerous or too politically sensitive for any other unit in the American military. Most people assumed it was just a myth, a story that grew out of rumor and speculation about black operations that could never be acknowledged. But Captain Morrison had seen enough classified briefings to know that some legends were true. "How do I know that emblem is real?" he asked. Maria pulled out her encrypted phone and dialed a number from memory. After a few seconds, she handed the phone to Captain Morrison. "Colonel Peterson, this is Captain Morrison. I have a civilian consultant here who claims to be from Unit 27. She's showing me an emblem that—" "Yes, sir. I understand, sir. Right away, sir." He handed the phone back to Maria with an expression of complete bewilderment. Colonel Peterson says you have full authorization to conduct operations as you see fit, and that I'm to provide any support you require without question. Maria nodded and continued toward the exit. Tell Lieutenant Commander Mitchell that I'm coming in through the south entrance in 15 minutes. His team should be ready to provide covering fire, but they should not engage unless I specifically call for backup. Ma'am, Captain Morrison called after her, what should I tell them about who you really are? Maria paused at the door. Tell them they're about to find out. 20 minutes later, Maria was crouched behind a concrete barrier about 50 yards from the main warehouse building, studying the structure and calculating angles of approach. She had changed from her civilian clothes into full tactical gear, and she carried equipment that looked deceptively similar to standard military issue, but was actually far more sophisticated. Team leader, this is Maria, she spoke into her radio, using her real name for the first time since the operation began. I'm in position for entry. Do you have eyes on the target building? Copy, Maria. We can see you from here. Ma'am, I have to ask, what exactly are you planning to do? I'm going to walk through the front door and have a conversation with Victor Kozlov. There was a long pause before Mitchell's voice came back through the radio. Ma'am, that sounds like suicide. Only if he doesn't recognize me. Maria stood up from behind the concrete barrier and began walking calmly toward the main entrance of the warehouse. She moved with the kind of confidence that could only come from someone who had done this exact thing many times before. As she approached the building, she could see movement behind the windows as Kozlov's people tracked her progress. She was counting on their confusion to buy her a few crucial seconds. They would be expecting a tactical assault or a negotiation team, not a single person walking up to the front door as if she was making a social visit. When she was about 20 feet from the entrance, a voice called out from inside the building. Stop where you are. State your identity and purpose. The voice was heavily accented, definitely Russian. This was almost certainly Victor Kozlov himself. My name is Maria Santos, Major, United States Army, Unit 27. I'm here to discuss terms. There was a much longer pause this time, and Maria could imagine the conversation taking place inside the building. Victor Kozlov was smart enough to know that Unit 27 wasn't something that most people would claim to be from unless they actually were. Approach slowly. Keep your hands visible. Maria walked the remaining distance to the entrance, pushed open the door, and stepped into the warehouse. The interior was dimly lit with shipping containers and industrial equipment creating a maze of hiding spots and defensive positions. She could see at least 3 armed figures positioned around the room, but her attention was focused on the man standing in the center of the space. Victor Kozlov was exactly what she would have expected from his file. Tall, heavily built, with the kind of scars that came from years of combat experience. He was pointing an assault rifle in her direction, but his finger wasn't on the trigger. Yet. Major Santos, he said, pronouncing her name carefully. We meet again. Hello, Victor. You're looking well for someone who spent 6 months in a military hospital. Kozlov's expression didn't change, but Maria could see recognition in his eyes. He remembered her from their previous encounter, just as she remembered him. I have to admit, he said, when I planned this operation, I was hoping they would send you. You are the only person who ever bested me in combat. And you're the only person who ever came close to killing me, Maria replied. Where are the hostages? Kozlov gestured toward a shipping container at the far end of the warehouse. They are unharmed, for now. What do you really want, Victor? Because I know this isn't about prisoner exchanges or political statements. You don't work for causes. You work for money. For the first time, Kozlov smiled slightly. You always were perceptive. You are correct. This operation is not about ideology. It is about settling a debt. What kind of debt? 3 years ago, you cost me and my organization a very lucrative contract. The people who hired us were not understanding about failure, and several of my associates paid a heavy price for our defeat." Maria nodded slowly. She had suspected that this operation was personal, but now she understood the full scope of what was happening. "So this was all a setup to draw me out of retirement." "Indeed, though I had to take actual hostages to make the situation credible. I apologize for involving innocent people, but I needed to ensure that the American government would send their best." "And now what? We fight to the death in front of 3 terrified civilians?" Kozlov considered this for a moment. "That was my original plan, but I find myself curious about something." "What's that?" "I have heard rumors that Unit 27 no longer exists, that it was disbanded after some kind of political controversy. Yet here you are." Maria felt a chill of realization. Kozlov was fishing for information about current American special operations capabilities. This wasn't just about personal revenge. This was intelligence gathering. "Unit 27 exists as long as there are threats that can't be handled by conventional forces," she said carefully. "Threats like me?" "Threats like you." The two of them stared at each other across the warehouse floor, each calculating odds and options. Maria could hear the faint sound of radio chatter through her earpiece, probably Lieutenant Commander Mitchell updating Captain Morrison on the situation. Finally, Viktor Kozlov lowered his weapon slightly. "I propose an alternative to our original plan," he said. "I'm listening. Single combat. You and me, no weapons, no backup. If you win, I release the hostages and surrender myself to American authorities. If I win, I take you as an additional hostage and negotiate for the release of my imprisoned associate." Maria considered this offer. It was insane, but it was also exactly the kind of unconventional solution that might work. "What guarantee do I have that your people won't interfere?" "My word as a former officer in the Russian Special Forces." It wasn't much of a guarantee, but Maria had fought against Viktor Kozlov before, and she knew that despite his criminal activities, he still operated by a certain code of honor. "Accepted," she said, unstrapping her tactical vest and placing her weapons on the ground. What followed was the kind of fight that very few people ever witness, and even fewer survive. Viktor Kozlov had been trained by the best special forces instructors in the Russian military, and he had 20 years of combat experience to draw upon. But Maria had been trained by people who didn't officially exist, in methods that were never written down in any manual. The fight lasted almost 10 minutes, ranging across the warehouse floor and involving improvised weapons, environmental hazards, and techniques that would have been illegal in any sporting competition. Both fighters sustained significant injuries, but Maria's smaller size and superior speed eventually gave her the advantage she needed. When it was over, Viktor Kozlov was unconscious on the concrete floor, and Maria was kneeling beside him, checking for serious injuries. Despite everything, she had no desire to see him dead. "This is Maria," she spoke into her radio. "Target neutralized. Hostages are secure. Send in medical support for the wounded." "Copy that, Maria. Team moving in now." 5 minutes later, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell and his SEAL team entered the warehouse to find Maria sitting calmly next to the unconscious Viktor Kozlov, while 3 very relieved hostages huddled together near the shipping container where they had been held. "Ma'am," Mitchell said, looking around at the evidence of the fight that had just taken place. "Are you injured?" "Nothing that won't heal," Maria replied, though she was pretty sure she had at least 2 cracked ribs and a dislocated shoulder. As the SEALs secured the other hostage-takers and began processing the scene, Petty Officer Rodriguez approached Maria with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Ma'am, I have to ask, who the hell are you really?" Maria looked at him for a moment, then reached up and unstrapped her helmet. For the first time, Rodriguez could clearly see the emblem on the left side, the combination of symbols that identified her as a member of the most classified military unit in American history. "My name is Major Maria Santos. United States Army Special Activities Division, Unit 27. For the past 20 years, I have conducted operations in 17 countries against threats that the American people will never know existed. Rodriguez stared at the emblem, trying to process what he was seeing. But you told us you were transportation. Transportation was my cover story, just like logistics coordinator is my cover story now. People see what they expect to see, and they expect to see a small woman who drives trucks and processes shipping manifests. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell had been listening to this conversation, and now he stepped forward to get a better look at Maria's helmet. "Ma'am, those stains on your helmet, we thought they were rust." Maria looked down at the helmet in her hands, at the reddish-brown marks that covered parts of its surface. "They're not rust," she said quietly. "They're dried blood from missions that officially never happened, in places that don't exist on any public maps, against enemies that the government will never acknowledge." The warehouse had fallen completely silent except for the distant sound of sirens as emergency medical teams arrived to treat the wounded. The 3 SEALs who had encountered Maria on the beach 3 weeks earlier were staring at her with expressions of absolute shock. "The beach," Thompson said finally. "You were just sitting there meditating." "I was remembering," Maria corrected. "Remembering the people I couldn't save, the missions that went wrong, the cost of doing things that have to be done but can never be discussed." She stood up slowly, favoring her injured side, and looked around at the SEAL team. "You're good soldiers," she told them. "Some of the best I've worked with, but I hope you never have to do the kinds of things that earned these stains." As Maria walked toward the warehouse exit, where Captain Morrison and a team of military medics were waiting to treat her injuries, she could hear the SEALs talking quietly among themselves. "Jesus Christ," Rodriguez was saying. "We made fun of her rusty helmet." "That's not rust," Mitchell replied, his voice full of something that might have been respect or might have been horror. "That's the blood of people who died in wars that we're not allowed to know existed." Maria didn't look back. She had spent 20 years in the shadows, protecting people who would never know her name or understand what she had sacrificed for them. Today, for just a few hours, she had stepped back into the light. Tomorrow, she would return to her quiet life in Los Angeles, to her cover job and her therapy sessions and her carefully constructed normal existence. But tonight, 3 innocent people were going home to their families because someone had been willing to do what needed to be done. It was enough. It had always been enough. As she walked away from the warehouse, Maria Santos allowed herself a small smile. The SEALs would never look at a weathered veteran the same way again. Sometimes the most important lessons were the ones that taught you how little you actually knew about the people around you. And sometimes the most dangerous person in the room was the one who looked like nobody special at all.